Folks, welcome back. As you know, I'm a big fan of our friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom. They are defending freedom. They're heroes. We bring them on now and again to kind of get an update on some of the things they're working on. So it's a joy right now to bring on ADF's Ryan Bangert. Ryan, welcome back.
Eric, so good to be here. Thank you for having me back on.
Well, it's just always sheer encouragement to me to talk to you and to hear what ADF is doing, because I think a lot of people, we hear the bad news in the news about what's happening, and you wonder, is anybody doing anything about it? And you guys are. So I just want to hear about some of the things you're working on at ADF. Yeah.
The work is never finished. I was reflecting this morning. The Roman poet Horace once said, "A truth once spoken can never be recalled." And I would amend that as an ADF senior executive to say that the truth must be repeatedly spoken or it's often forgotten. And the reality is that freedom of speech and the fight for truth is a conversation that we're always engaged in. And one example of that is a case that was just decided on April 4th over in the UK. It was decided by a magistrate judge, and it was a ruling against our client, Livia Tascabolt. Livia is a woman who, for years, has simply held a sign that says, "Here to talk if you want," near an abortion clinic in Bournemouth. And unfortunately for her, the authorities judged that her sign, which she held quietly, she wasn't disrupting anything. In fact, testimony at her trial from law enforcement came in that says she was never disruptive, she never harassed anyone. She held this sign quietly, "Here to talk if you want," near an abortion clinic. And the authorities judged that that violated a protected space protective order, which basically said that, and I'm going to get you the exact language from this order because it's just shocking. The order says that any, quote, protesting, engaging in an act of approval or disapproval, or attempted act of approval or disapproval with respect to issues related to abortion services cannot be undertaken in an area around an abortion clinic, even if it's on public ground. And she was convicted on April 4th, so just 5 days ago, of violating that law.
This is such lunacy. It really beggars the imagination. You cannot, you have to try hard to imagine that these kinds of things could be happening in a place. This is not Saudi Arabia. This is not North Korea or China or the former Soviet Union. This is England. That to me is the most horrifying thing of all. And I think it brings up the larger issue, because when you hear about things like this happening in the United States, it's truly shocking. But when it happens in England, it's a little bit less shocking, because you get the idea that they never really understood these fundamental principles in the way we do in the United States of America. They've always been hedging their bets. I'm writing a book on the American Revolution, and it's astonishing to think how high-handed King George III was, even though you had members of parliament speaking strongly against him and the policies of his government and saying, this is not the way we treat our fellow Britons. This is wrong. This goes against our Constitution. He didn't really care. And you see this kind of thing happening where people sort of get it, but it's not enshrined in law sufficiently that it never happens, that this kind of tyranny or high-handedness would occur. And that's exactly what we have in England. In other words, most of the West, most of Western Europe has slid in this kind of direction. They don't get the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the way we do in the United States. And so there's a lot of gray area. And this to me is the classic case where you just think, well, there it is. If you wanted proof that they're crazy, if you wanted proof that they don't understand liberty, freedom of speech, any of this stuff, it's lamentable. But I guess it's kind of a warning to us in the United States, isn't it, Ryan, that we have to be vigilant. And that's, again, why I want to have you and ADF's other ADF spokespeople on the program, that we have to be vigilant, because it's not like we say, oh, well, it's a free country, now we're done. We keep having to fight, because the loony left, the enemies of freedom, they continue pushing back, and it's always in one direction. I mean, the fact that she's standing outside an abortion clinic holding this, you kind of know that they've got it out for her to begin with.
They do. And, Eric, I think that's a really important point that you raise about the need for nature is at all times the same everywhere across the world. The desire to control the narrative, the desire to limit speech is something that is innate because humans ultimately desire power. And those in authority are going to want to exercise that power to advance their preferred narrative. And you look at the United States, we're very fortunate that we have the First Amendment because the First Amendment is a chosen constraint that we've imposed upon ourselves and our leaders and our government in particular not to exercise that sort of inherent aspect of human nature. And so there are a number of examples I can give you right now, though, of cases that ADF is going to be arguing. In fact, two before the U.S. Supreme Court that raise this very question of whether we're going to honor that constraint that the First Amendment places on government. And those two cases involve the Drummond case coming up at the end of this month and the Childs case coming up in the fall. So those are just two examples of.
Before we get to those, because I want to talk to you about those, but just I did not know that ADF was doing work beyond the United States. How was it that you were involved in this case in the UK?
The ADF has a very significant presence in the EU as well as other places across the globe. And we frequently engage in litigation or support litigation on behalf of those whose free speech rights are limited. I mean, certainly Päivi Räsänen is a good example, Finnish member of parliament who was prosecuted in that country for simply sending a tweet trying to call her church back to a biblical understanding of human sexuality. We also represented Adam Smith Connor. Adam Smith Connor is a military veteran in the UK, ironically prosecuted and convicted by the exact same judge who convicted Levia. And he was assessed a fine of he was assessed prosecution costs of £9,000. By the way, Levy was assessed costs of £20,000. But Adam Smith Connor was convicted because he was simply standing outside this abortion clinic with his back to the clinic, praying silently to himself. And when he was confronted by law enforcement, they had to ask him, "What are you doing?" And he, of course, being an honest man, said, "Well, I'm praying in my mind." He wasn't even praying audibly. And he was convicted for that. So incredibly enough.
Now, I have to say, I've heard that story, and it doesn't really make any sense to me. It's one thing if somebody's holding up a sign. It's something I can kind of get my head around what their objection is, as stupid, as ridiculous as it is. But somebody standing and then with their own mouth saying, "I was praying in my mind," it's unfathomable to me. This looks to me like such a perversion of justice that I'm staggered by it. I don't understand how that's even possible.
Well, it is staggering. And I think it demonstrates just how quickly we can lapse into, we even in the West, can lapse into totalitarian tendencies if we're not carefully and vigorously policing these constraints and these boundaries we've placed upon ourselves to ensure that our governments are not stepping on free speech.
Well, you said it earlier about, truth. I mean, because we live in a fallen world, ladies and gentlemen, because of the law of entropy, we have to be vigilant constantly against this. The way things slide when we do nothing is toward evil, toward tyranny. That's the way of this broken, sinful world. So we who answer to a higher authority, we have to be vigilant. And again, this is why I praise the work of Alliance Defending Freedom. I hope people will support you. By the way, we're not doing a fundraiser for you right now, but anybody who wants to know a great organization to support. And I keep saying that those of us, if you do nothing, folks, you're going to get more and more of this kind of thing. It's stunning because I think so many of us have been spoiled living in the United States, which has been a free country, that these things every once in a while something comes up. But this is really, really chilling what's going on in the UK. And I think before we go to the break, and I want to hear more about some of the stuff ADF is doing here in the US, you were just alluding to that. But before um, we go to the break, I just want to say that uh, we have to take this seriously. What we're talking about here is evil. It only works in one direction. It only works when you speak up for the unborn. You see this over and over and over again. And if you look the other way, you're complicit. And so you can give money to Lines Defending Freedom. You can do. Every one of us can do all kinds of stuff. But this is very serious. It's affected me. And so when we come back, we're talking to Ryan Bangert with ADF. Don't go away. Welcome back, folks. We're talking to Ryan Bangert, who's with the Alliance Defending Freedom. We've just been talking about this insane case in Europe. And what I didn't have a chance to say a moment ago, Ryan, is that Vice President J.D. Vance, when he gave the speech recently in Munich, was talking about this. What has happened to our Western allies? If you want us to stand with you, we have to share values. We used to share values, but what we're seeing in Germany, you mentioned Finland, in the UK, they do not share the values that we have traditionally shared. And if they don't, we will not stand with them. We cannot stand with countries that are tyrannous toward their own citizens. And so this is a real cultural moment. It's an historical moment. But I wanted to talk to you about what's going on in the United States. You mentioned the Drummond case. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pick up on what you said about JD Vance. I mean, it's so important because he is calling our friends back to their highest ideals. And it's so important for us to restate the truth over and over again. I mean, we often talk about the need to be the chief reminding officers, the CMOs of our culture. As believers, all of us have a responsibility to consistently remind our fellow citizens about these fundamental truths. And I think the Drummond case is a good example of that. The Drummond case it rises from Oklahoma, and ADF represents the charter school board in Oklahoma, which agreed to allow a virtual school, St. Isidore of Seville School, Catholic school, to join the charter school program in Oklahoma. And a lawsuit was filed challenging that decision. And the argument was made, you can't allow a Catholic school to be part of a charter school program and receive government money through that program because it's religious in nature. Because this virtual charter school is, in the words of the challenger, serving as a state actor, and we just cannot allow these state funds to flow to this religious school under this
And this
program.
is, I mean, honestly, this is such a big issue for me. A number of years ago, Father Richard John Newhouse wrote a famous book called The Naked Public Square, where he makes this case that you cannot have a secularized public square. This idea that we should push religion out of public life or out of anything touching the government or government, it's not constitutional. It doesn't make any sense. But this is a classic case here where you have people saying, oh, it's a religious school, as though any school were not espousing certain values. What are the values that we're allowed to espouse? It's preposterous. Our government, our constitution says that the government, the state, is not supposed to have a heavy hand in telling us what we can believe and what we can't believe. And here you have a classic case, literally a legal case, where you have people saying you cannot have government funds or you cannot be established as a charter school because what? You believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus? You believe in the Bible? What is their animus against a school that has Christian roots? They're not teaching Christian math. They're just teaching math. What is the problem? And what is it? So the fact that the Alliance Defending Freedom has to step in, you said this is Oklahoma.
It is.
So where does this stand right now?
So we're going to argue this case before the U.S. Supreme Court on April 30th. So only a few weeks away, the U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case and consider whether this charter school, this Catholic charter school, which was fully qualified to act as a charter school by the appropriate authority, the charter school board, has to be thrown out of the program solely because of its religious character. And that's a very important question, I think, for all of us, because it implicates whether or not there will be real choice on the part of individuals when they're selecting a charter school, whether they can actually choose among the various charter schools one that espouses a Christian worldview, one that espouses Christian belief, or whether the state has the authority, in fact, the obligation, in the words of the challengers, to throw this school out of the program because of its religious nature. It's astounding.
I mean, it's funny because I would say that the state has an obligation to throw out schools that are teaching Marxist doctrine, that are teaching DEI, all of this fundamentally anti-American lunacy. Christian religious teaching is not fundamentally anti-American. In fact, I would argue just the opposite. But there is all kinds of education going on, funded by the state, approved of by the state, pushing Marxist atheist doctrines, which fundamentally undermine the Constitution and our American values. Those aren't being challenged. Frankly, they should be challenged. I wish they would be challenged. I'm just curious, is there not a precedent legally that there are charter schools that have Christian roots out there? I mean, it seems strange to me that this should come up, I guess.
Well, there are plenty of precedents, and I think the Supreme Court's been very clear that the state cannot discriminate in the provision of state funds to otherwise eligible organizations merely because of their religious character. The Trinity Lutheran Church case, a case that ADF argued several years ago, I think is right on point here. That involved a program, it was called the Scrap Tire Program in Missouri, where I used to live. And this church, a church which had a preschool, applied to this program to resurface its playground. And they qualified, they were deemed one of the top applicants for the funds. And when the agency went back and looked at the church, they said, oh, wait a minute, you're a religious institution. You can't participate as a religious institution in a Christian school in this program and receive state funds because you're religious, because you're a Christian. And the court said, absolutely not. That decision by the state violates the Constitution. So we think there's very clear precedent here. And we're very hopeful that the court will simply apply that precedent, which is already decided, and extend it to this case here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll be right back, folks, talking to Ryan Bangert of the Alliance Defending Freedom. Talking to Ryan Bangert, who is with the Alliance Defending Freedom, doing such great work. And it's wonderful, to hear these stories, Ryan, and to know that you guys are out there and arguing at places like the Supreme Court. It is amazing to me because you said in the beginning that we have to be vigilant. In other words, if we don't argue, the challenges to common sense and to, basic truths are constant. Every time you turn around, somebody is challenging something that ought not to be challenged. And you kind of wonder why our side doesn't do the same. In other words, why don't we challenge aggressive secularism? Why don't we challenge aggressive Marxist ideas being taught in schools? We ought to be challenging that. We ought to be far more vigilant on our side to put them on the defensive, because they don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to this kind of stuff, and they should be challenged. But typically, it's only that side that challenges our side.
That's right, and I'm happy to report that the tide on that is turning. A number of public schools have begun instituting policies. We call them secret gender transition policies, where the policy requires teachers, requires administrators not to tell parents what's happening with their kids. So kids will show up to school, they'll tell the teacher or they'll tell the school counselor, hey, I'm a boy, but I think I'm a girl. I want to start dressing like a girl or accessing female facilities. And the school policy will say, okay, we'll honor that, and we're not going to tell your parent about what we're doing unless you give us permission, which invariably is not the case. And so we've been challenging those left and right all over the country. We have a number of lawsuits pending. And there's one lawsuit in particular that I think is relevant to that, which is a case that's going to be argued before the U.S. Supreme Court next fall by ADF. The court just granted cert, and it involves a counselor in the state of Colorado. Again, Colorado, for some reason, seems to violate constitutional rights left and right. But this counselor was told by the state licensing board, pursuant to a state law, that when she's counseling kids who are in this situation, who are struggling with their gender identity, that she can only counsel them in one direction. She can say, hey, if you're a male but you feel like you're a female, well, I will counsel you into this transgender lifestyle. But if she contests that, she says, hold on a minute, wait a minute, let's help you live comfortably with your biological sex. That's actually grounds for losing her license. So we're taking that case to the Supreme Court next fall. So this is a comprehensive effort, as you pointed out. Why aren't we pushing back against these false narratives, these woke narratives? Well, these are two examples: fighting secret gender transitions in public schools, and then fighting for the rights of counselors to help kids live consistently with their biological sex. We're having to fight on that ground, and we are fighting on that ground, and the Supreme Court's going to hear the case of our counselor, Kaylee Childs, next fall.
I mean, it is just extraordinary. Again, I'm just so grateful to the Alliance Defending Freedom. I cannot I'm horrified to think where we'd be without you guys, because this affects us. This is major stuff. I know there's a few other subjects before we run out of time. I know there's a debanking bill in Idaho, and then there was something else you wanted to talk about, I think.
Yeah, no, you mentioned debanking, and this is exactly consistent with the theme we've been talking about all along, which is concentrated power pushing back against narratives and viewpoints the power doesn't like. In this case, these are large multinational or international banks, usually over $100 billion in assets, that are removing financial services from customers because of the customer's political or religious viewpoints. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute, they're not subject to the First Amendment. That's true. Oftentimes, these banks that were reacting to pressure from regulators, and there's a great example of that. Back in last year, the House Select Subcommittee on Weaponization of Government, released a report showing that a number of different federal agencies, the Treasury Department, FBI, FinCEN, which is within the Treasury Department, were sending guidance to banks, telling them to watch out for transactions involving hate groups, alleged hate groups. Now, these hate groups was a list that was compiled by a far left-wing organization, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and among the groups listed by the ISD, ADF, and several other socially conservative groups. So here's
Oh
a
no, this
federal.
is think how wicked this is, folks. Just think how wicked this is. They use the term hate groups, knowing there are going to be enough people that are ignorant enough to buy it, but it is absolute partisan vileness. They are just vile, nasty, using terms like hate groups. Of course, they are the only ones guilty of hate, but we're seeing a lot of that. And I just find it interesting that corporate culture, I mean, I have to say, over the last, let's say, 20 years, I've been staggered to see how, I mean, cowardly is the best term you could use. A lot of corporate entities are big banks. They couldn't care less about truth, what is right and wrong. They're just going with the flow, precisely the way many businesses did in Nazi Germany. They thought, well, what do we need to do to keep making a buck? We're not going to stand up for what is right or true. But the idea that American corporations would be led by people who think that way, that big banks would be led by people that think that way, that's a frightening moment. It's why we need revival in this country. It's why we need vigilant patriot citizens fighting on every front. And you guys at ADF, I mean, you're just doing such good work. Ryan, maybe people think I'm blowing smoke here. I really sometimes am just stunned when I think, where would we be without you guys doing this? Because most people are busy and we just don't have time. So it's amazing. We've just got a minute left. Any final thoughts on any of these cases?
Yeah, Eric, just two things. One, these debanking laws are really setting up counter pressure on these financial institutions so that they don't have to, they actually have a good reason not to bend to this pressure from federal regulators. But on your point about revival and the need for revival, I think that's absolutely essential because the hearts and minds of the people, if we turn back to God, if we turn back to fundamental eternal truths, that really makes all the difference. I know Rod Dreher wrote a book, Live Not by Lies. Angel Studios, I think, was releasing a series of films talking about that. But the bottom line there is, on the other side of the world, decades ago, behind the Iron Curtain, you had individuals who, heeding the call of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, decided, I am not going to let the lie be perpetrated through me. I am making an individual choice as someone committed to the truth, not to allow the lie to be perpetrated. It stops here. It's not going to be propagated or perpetrated through me. And I think all of us bear that responsibility in our culture today. And revival, I think, is the fastest way and the best way and the only
No
way
doubt.
to come to
No
that
doubt.
place.
Ryan Bangert, Alliance Defending Freedom, thank you.
Thank you, Eric.